The divorce hit me harder than I expected. After 15 years of marriage, I found myself alone in my apartment, surrounded by boxes and memories. I needed to clear my head, to find myself again. That's when I decided to take a solo camping trip to the Adirondacks. I'd always loved the outdoors, but Mark had never been interested. Now, I thought, was my chance to reconnect with nature and myself. I packed my gear, loaded up my old Subaru, and hit the road. The drive from Albany to the Adirondack Park was beautiful, with the fall colors just starting to peek through the green. I chose a remote campsite, wanting to avoid the crowds and truly immerse myself in solitude. As I set up my tent and organized my supplies, I felt a sense of accomplishment. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and earth. That first night, I sat by my small campfire, watching the flames dance and listening to the forest sounds around me. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. The next morning, I woke up refreshed and ready to explore. I spent the day hiking, taking in the stunning views of the mountains and lakes. I even spotted a deer and her fawn, reminding me of the raw beauty of nature. As the sun began to set, I made my way back to the campsite, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. I heated up some soup on my portable stove and settled in for the night. The temperature had dropped, so I bundled up in my sleeping bag, feeling snug and safe in my little tent. I drifted off to sleep, lulled by the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when I first heard it. A deep, heavy breathing sound coming from just outside my tent. At first, in my groggy state, I thought it might be the wind. But as I became more alert, a chill ran down my spine. This wasn't the wind. This was something alive, something big. My heart began to race as I realized what it must be. A bear. I'd read about bear safety, knew they were common in the area, but nothing could have prepared me for the terror of actually being this close to one. I lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, as I listened to the creature moving around my campsite. I could hear it snuffling, pawing at things. The sound of ripping fabric told me it had found my food bag, which I'd stupidly left outside instead of hanging in a tree. I silently cursed myself for the rookie mistake. As the bear finished with my food, I prayed it would leave. But to my horror, it started circling my tent. I could see its shadow in the moonlight, massive and terrifying. It was so close I could smell its musky odor, hear every snort and growl. Hours passed like this. I was paralyzed with fear, my muscles aching from staying so still. Every time I thought the bear might be leaving, it would return, seeming more agitated each time. I wanted desperately to call for help, but my phone lay useless beside me. No service this deep in the wilderness. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I heard a new sound. The unmistakable noise of claws on fabric. The bear was scratching at my tent. I held my breath, praying the thin material would hold. But then came a loud rip, and suddenly, the bear's enormous head was inside my tent. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I didn't think, I just acted. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it directly in the bear's eyes while shouting as loud as I could. The bear, startled, backed out of the tent. But I knew it wouldn't stay away for long. I had seconds to decide what to do. Stay and hope the bear leaves, or run. The choice was made for me when I heard the bear charging back towards the tent. I unzipped the tent fly and bolted. Running through a pitch-black forest in the middle of the night is not something I ever want to experience again. Branches whipped my face, roots threatened to trip me at every step. I could hear the bear crashing through the underbrush behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I just ran, fueled by pure adrenaline and terror. I don't know how long I ran or how far. Time seemed to stretch and warp. At some point, I tripped and fell down a small embankment, landing hard on my side. The fall knocked the wind out of me, and for a terrifying moment, I thought this was it. This was how I would die. But as I lay there gasping for breath, I realized I couldn't hear the bear anymore. Had I lost it? Or had it never actually chased me? In my panic, had I imagined the whole pursuit? I stayed there, huddled at the bottom of the embankment, for what felt like hours. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf sent a jolt of fear through me. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I finally felt safe enough to move. Sore, scratched, and utterly exhausted, I began to try to find my way back to civilization. It was mid-morning when I finally stumbled onto a hiking trail. An hour later, I encountered a group of hikers who helped me get back to the ranger station. The rangers were kind, but clearly thought I had overreacted. They found my campsite later that day. The tent was shredded, and there were bear prints everywhere, but the bear itself was long gone. They said I was lucky. Black bears rarely attack humans, but this one had clearly been more aggressive than usual. I drove home that same day, my camping trip cut drastically short. As I showered and tended to my cuts and bruises, I couldn't shake the memory of those terrifying hours in the tent, listening to the bear breathe, wondering if each moment would be my last. I've been back home for a week now. I still jump at unexpected noises, and I'm not sure I'll ever go camping alone again, but strangely, I don't regret the trip. In those moments of sheer terror, I found a strength in myself I didn't know I had, and somehow that makes facing my new life alone a little less daunting. Hey there. Hope you're enjoying the video so far. If you do, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel to grow and reach more people. And now. I never imagined a simple camping trip could turn into something so terrifying. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway with my college buddies, just 4 of us looking to blow off some steam before finals. We chose the Ozarks, thinking it'd be the perfect spot to disconnect and enjoy nature. We arrived at the campground on a Friday afternoon, the air crisp with the promise of adventure. After setting up our tents and getting a fire going, we cracked open some beers and started sharing stories. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds, crickets chirping, leaves rustling, and the occasional hoot of an owl. Saturday morning, we decided to go on a hike. The trail we chose was supposed to be an easy one, winding through dense forest and offering scenic views of the surrounding mountains. We packed some snacks, filled our water bottles, and set off, spirits high and ready for whatever nature had in store for us. About 2 hours into our hike, Jake, always the explorer, suggested we veer off the main trail to check out what he thought might be a hidden waterfall. We were all game for a little adventure, so we followed him through the underbrush. The forest grew denser, the canopy above blocking out most of the sunlight. I remember feeling a bit uneasy, like we were trespassing somewhere we shouldn't be. After pushing through thick vegetation for what felt like ages, we suddenly came upon a clearing. At first, I thought we'd stumbled onto someone's campsite, but as my eyes adjusted to the brighter light, I realized we were witnessing something far more disturbing. In the center of the clearing stood a crude altar made of stacked stones. Around it, 5 or 6 people, I couldn't get an exact count, were moving in a slow, rhythmic circle. They were dressed in ordinary clothes, jeans, t-shirts, nothing out of the ordinary, but their movements were anything but normal. We quickly ducked behind some trees, our hearts pounding. From our hiding spot, we could see and hear everything. The group was chanting in a language I didn't recognize, their voices low and guttural. Every few moments, one of them would break from the circle to approach the altar, making strange gestures with their hands. What happened next made my blood run cold. A woman in a red flannel shirt stepped up to the altar carrying a small dark object. As she raised it above her head, I realized with horror that it was a dead animal, a rabbit or maybe a squirrel. She began to speak louder than the others, her words sharp and commanding. Then, to our shock and disgust, she produced a knife and cut into the animal's body. Dark liquid, blood, dripped onto the altar stones. The chanting grew louder, more frenzied. The other participants swayed and jerked, their movements becoming more erratic. I felt Mike grab my arm, his fingers digging into my skin. When I looked at him, his face was pale, eyes wide with fear. Sarah was covering her mouth with both hands, trying to stifle her panicked breathing. Jake, usually the bravest of us, was trembling visibly. We knew we had to get out of there. But how? The clearing was the only break in the dense forest for as far as we could see. If we tried to leave, we'd have to push through thick undergrowth. which would surely make noise and alert the group to our presence. For what felt like an eternity, we stayed frozen in place, watching this nightmarish scene unfold. The ritual continued, with each person taking turns at the altar adding more blood, chanting words that made no sense but filled me with dread. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, the woman in the red flannel shirt suddenly stopped and turned her head in our direction. For a heart-stopping moment, I was sure she had seen us. Her eyes seemed to bore right through the trees where we were hiding. I held my breath, certain that at any second she would point us out and the whole group would descend upon us. But then, as abruptly as she had stopped, she turned back to the altar and resumed the chanting. It was then that Jake tugged on my sleeve and pointed to a small gap in the trees to our left. It wasn't much, but it might be enough for us to slip away unnoticed. Moving as slowly and quietly as we could, we began to edge away from the clearing. Every snapping twig under our feet sounded like a gunshot to my ears. I was sure that at any moment we'd hear shouts behind us, footsteps rushing in our direction. But somehow, miraculously, we made it. Once we felt we were far enough away, we broke into a run, crashing through the forest with no regard for stealth anymore. We ran until our lungs burned, and our legs felt like jelly, the sound of our own panicked breathing drowning out everything else. When we finally stopped gasping for air, we realized we had no idea where we were. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. We were lost in the Ozark wilderness, with no trail in sight, and the memory of that horrifying ritual fresh in our minds. Sarah started to cry, the stress of the situation finally breaking her. Mike tried to comfort her while Jake and I argued about what to do next. Should we try to find our way back to the campsite? Or just pick a direction and hope we hit a road or trail eventually? In the end, we decided to try and retrace our steps. It was risky. We might end up back at that clearing, but it was our best chance of finding the original trail. We moved cautiously, jumping at every sound, convinced that the people from the ritual were hunting us down. As darkness fell, the forest became a different world. Shadows seemed to move on their own, and every rustle in the underbrush sounded like footsteps. We used the flashlights on our phones sparingly, afraid of drawing attention to ourselves but needing the light to avoid tripping over roots and rocks. It was well past midnight when we finally stumbled onto a familiar landmark, a oddly shaped boulder we'd passed on our original hike. From there, we were able to find our way back to the main trail and eventually our campsite. We didn't even discuss it. We just started packing up our gear as fast as we could. None of us wanted to spend another minute in those woods. We hiked back to where we'd parked our car, our nerves frayed and jumpy. As we drove away from the campground, a heavy silence hung in the car. We were exhausted, scared, and struggling to process what we'd seen. Part of me wanted to report it to the authorities, but what would we say? That we saw some people performing a weird ritual in the woods? We had no proof, and it sounded crazy even to us who had witnessed it. In the days and weeks that followed, we tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was just some harmless neo-pagan group practicing their beliefs. Maybe it was all some elaborate hoax or prank. But deep down, I knew that what we'd witnessed was something darker, something that defied explanation. We never went camping in the Ozarks again. In fact, we never really talked about that day after that. But sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I can still hear those chants echoing in my head. And I wonder about the people in that clearing, and what dark forces they were trying to conjure in the heart of the forest. As a wildlife photographer, I've always been drawn to the raw beauty of nature. That's what led me to plan a solo expedition to Yellowstone National Park last summer. I'd spent months preparing, researching the best spots to capture the park's diverse ecosystem and its more elusive inhabitants. Little did I know that this trip would leave me with memories far different from the stunning landscapes and wildlife I'd hoped to photograph. I arrived at Yellowstone on a warm June afternoon, my SUV packed with camping gear and my prized camera equipment. The first few days were exactly what I'd dreamed of. I managed to snap some incredible shots of bison herds grazing in the golden light of dawn, a family of grizzlies fishing in a crystal-clear stream, and even a lone wolf silhouetted against a blazing sunset. Each night I'd fall asleep in my tent, exhausted but exhilarated, eager for what the next day would bring. It was on the fourth night that everything changed. I'd set up camp in a remote area of the park, far from the usual tourist trails. My tent was nestled in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to whisper secrets in the gentle breeze. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I settled in for the night. I reviewed the day's photos on my camera, planning my route for the following morning, and eventually drifted off to sleep, lulled by the soft sounds of the forest. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when I was jolted awake by the sound of voices. At first I thought I was dreaming. The digital display on my watch read 2:17 a.m. Who else would be out here in the middle of the night? But as I became more alert, I realized the voices were real and getting closer. My heart started racing. I knew I was miles from any designated campsite or trail. Something wasn't right. I reached for my night vision monocular, a piece of equipment I'd brought along for nocturnal wildlife observation. With trembling hands, I peered out of my tent, careful not to make a sound. What I saw made my blood run cold. About 50 yards away, illuminated in the eerie green glow of my night vision, was a group of people. 4 of them, I counted. They weren't dressed like hikers or campers. These people were wearing dark clothes, and they seemed to be carrying shovels and other equipment I couldn't quite make out. I watched, frozen in place, as they began to dig. They worked quickly and efficiently, as if they'd done this before. My mind raced with possibilities. Were they archaeologists on some secret dig? Treasure hunters? But deep down, I knew it was something far more sinister. The way they kept looking around, their hushed whispers, the urgency in their movements, it all pointed to something illegal, something dangerous. After what felt like hours but was probably only about 30 minutes, they stopped digging. 2 of them reached down into the hole and lifted something long and wrapped in what looked like plastic sheeting. A chill ran down my spine as the reality of what I was witnessing hit me. This was a body. I was watching a group of people bury a body in the middle of Yellowstone National Park. I wanted to run, to scream, to do something, but fear kept me rooted to the spot. What if they saw me? What if they heard me? I was alone out here, miles from help. So I stayed silent, watching through my night vision as they lowered the body into the hole and began to fill it in. The next few hours were the longest of my life. I didn't dare move or make a sound. I barely allowed myself to breathe. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me convinced they had discovered me and were coming to silence me too. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, and I was sure they could hear it too. As they finished filling in the hole, one of them, a tall man with broad shoulders, looked in my direction. I ducked down, pressing myself against the floor of my tent, praying they hadn't seen me. When I dared to look again, they were gathering their tools. They spoke in hushed tones, too low for me to make out any words. Then, as silently as they had appeared, they melted back into the forest. I remained in my tent, paralyzed with fear, until the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. Only then did I allow myself to move, to breathe normally again. My mind was reeling. What should I do? Go to the rangers? The police? But what if these people had connections? What if reporting this put me in danger? I packed up my camp in record time, my hands shaking so badly I could barely tie my bootlaces. As I shouldered my backpack, a thought struck me. I had evidence. My camera. In my panic, I had forgotten that I'd instinctively started recording when I first heard the voices. With trembling fingers, I turned on my camera and checked the footage. My heart sank. The screen was black. In my haste and fear, I hadn't removed the lens cap. I had no proof of what I'd witnessed, just the vivid, terrifying memories etched into my mind. I hiked back to my car in a daze, jumping at every sound, convinced I was being followed. The forest that had seemed so welcoming just days ago now felt oppressive and threatening. Every shadow held potential danger, every rustle of leaves a possible pursuer. When I finally reached the parking lot, I all but threw my gear into the trunk and sped away, not stopping until I was miles from Yellowstone. For days after, I debated what to do. I couldn't shake the image of that body being lowered into the ground. The memory of those people, their efficient movements, their hushed voices. It all haunted me. But without evidence, who would believe me? It would be my word against theirs, and I had no idea who they were or how dangerous they might be. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that hole in the ground, that body wrapped in plastic. I lost my appetite. The thought of food made me nauseous as I remembered the sickening thud of dirt hitting plastic. I couldn't focus on work. How could I go back to photographing serene landscapes and majestic animals when I knew what dark secrets the wilderness could hide? In the end, after a week of sleepless nights and anxiety-filled days, I made an anonymous call to the park rangers. My voice shook as I gave them the approximate location of where I'd been camping. I told them what I'd seen, trying to provide as much detail as I could remember. The ranger on the other end of the line listened patiently, asking a few questions. He thanked me for the information but didn't say whether they'd investigate or not. I don't know if they ever looked into it or found anything. I've been too scared to follow up or return to Yellowstone. Part of me wants to know if they found the body, if there's been any investigation, but another part of me is terrified of drawing attention to myself, of those people somehow finding out that I was the one who reported it. Sometimes, when I'm editing photos or setting up a shot, I'll remember that night, the voices in the darkness, the sight of that body wrapped in plastic, the terror of lying in my tent, barely breathing, sure that at any moment I'd be discovered. And I'll wonder if I did the right thing, if I should have done more. But then I remind myself that I'm alive to tell the tale, even if it's one I can never fully share. That summer night in Yellowstone taught me that sometimes the most terrifying things in nature aren't the wild animals or treacherous terrain. Sometimes the real monsters are the ones who walk on two legs and carry shovels in the dead of night. I still do wildlife photography, but I haven't been able to bring myself to go on any solo camping trips since then. The wilderness that once called to me now holds a darker allure, a reminder that not all secrets of nature are meant to be uncovered. And sometimes, the most chilling stories are the ones that remain untold, buried deep in the heart of the forest, waiting for an unwitting witness to stumble upon them in the dead of night. My husband and I had been planning our camping trip to the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness for months. As avid outdoors enthusiasts in our mid-50s, we were looking forward to a peaceful getaway from our busy lives in Minneapolis. Little did we know that our retreat into nature would turn into a nightmarish experience that still haunts me to this day. We arrived at the entry point on a warm Tuesday afternoon in late August. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the promise of adventure. After checking in with the ranger station and securing our permits, we loaded our canoe and set off into the pristine wilderness. The gentle lapping of water against our paddles and the occasional call of a loon were the only sounds breaking the serene silence. After a few hours of paddling and a short portage, we found the perfect spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing near the shore of a secluded lake, surrounded by towering pines and smooth granite outcroppings. We quickly got to work setting up our tent and organizing our gear. As the sun began to dip below the tree line, we sat by the shore, sipping hot cocoa and marveling at the vibrant colors painting the sky. Our tranquility was short-lived. Just as darkness fell, we heard voices carrying across the water. At first we thought nothing of it. Other campers settling in for the night, we assumed. But as we listened, it became clear that this was no ordinary campsite chatter. The voices grew louder, more agitated. A man's voice, gruff and angry, dominated the soundscape. "You never do anything right," the voice boomed. "Can't you see how useless you are?" My husband and I exchanged worried glances. The words were followed by the sound of something heavy being thrown or knocked over. A woman's voice, quieter but clearly distressed, tried to placate the man. Then, to our horror, we heard a child's frightened whimper. "Should we do something?" I whispered to my husband, my heart racing. He looked as uncertain as I felt. We were in a remote area, at least a day's journey from the nearest ranger station. What if intervening made the situation worse? We decided to wait and see if things calmed down. But as the night wore on, the shouting continued intermittently. Sometimes it would quiet down for an hour or so, only to erupt again with renewed vigor. Sleep was impossible. Every snapping twig or rustle in the underbrush made me jump, wondering if the conflict had escalated beyond words. As dawn broke, we emerged from our tent, bleary-eyed and on edge. The neighboring campsite was hidden from view by a thick stand of trees, but we could hear movement and low voices. My husband suggested we pack up and move our camp, but something held me back. What if the woman and child needed help? Determined to at least catch a glimpse of our neighbors, I suggested we take a morning walk that would casually pass by their site. As we rounded the bend, we saw a man in his late 30s breaking down a tent. A woman about the same age was packing supplies into a canoe, her movements hurried and tense. A young boy, no more than 8 or 9, sat on a rock, his eyes downcast. The man looked up as we approached. "Morning," he called out, his voice friendly but strained. "You folks headed out today?" My husband engaged him in small talk about fishing and portage routes while I observed the woman and child. The woman's eyes darted nervously between us and the man, and I noticed a dark bruise peeking out from under her sleeve. The boy never looked up. As we walked back to our campsite, my husband and I debated what to do. Should we offer help? Call the authorities once we got back to civilization? The woman hadn't asked for help, and we had no proof of abuse beyond what we'd overheard. Our indecision was cut short by a blood-curdling scream. Without thinking, we ran towards the other campsite. As we burst into the clearing, we saw the man gripping the woman's arm, twisting it at an unnatural angle. The boy was crying, pleading with his father to stop. "Hey!" my husband shouted, startling the man into releasing the woman. "What's going on here?" The man's face contorted with rage. "Mind your own damn business," he snarled, taking a menacing step towards us. In that moment, adrenaline took over. I grabbed a heavy branch from the ground and brandished it like a weapon. "Back off," I warned, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "We heard everything last night. This stops now, or we're swimming across this lake to get the rangers if we have to." The man's eyes darted between us, the woman and the boy. For a tense moment, I thought he might attack. Then, unexpectedly, his shoulders slumped. "Fine," he muttered. "We're leaving anyway." We stood watch as the family quickly packed up their remaining gear. The woman whispered a quiet, "Thank you," as she passed us, ushering her son into the canoe. The man glared at us one last time before pushing off from the shore. As we watched them disappear around a bend in the lake, I felt a mix of relief and unease. Had we done enough? Should we have done more? The rest of our trip was a blur of anxiety and second-guessing. Every sound in the night made me think of that frightened child. Every passing canoe made me wonder if the family was okay. When we finally made it back to the ranger station, we reported the incident. The rangers took our statement seriously but warned us that without more information, there wasn't much they could do. They promised to keep an eye out for the family and file a report with local authorities. We drove home in silence, the beauty of the Boundary Waters forever tarnished by those 2 nights of overheard violence and our own feelings of helplessness. I often wonder about that woman and her son, hoping they found safety, hoping our brief intervention made a difference. But I'll never know for sure, and that uncertainty is perhaps the most haunting part of all. I've always been an avid hiker and camper, but I never imagined that my love for the outdoors would lead me to the most terrifying night of my life. It was late October, and I decided to take a solo camping trip to the Catskills. The autumn colors were at their peak, and I wanted to experience the serenity of the mountains before winter set in. I arrived at the trailhead early in the afternoon, my backpack loaded with supplies for a 2-night stay. The air was crisp, and the scent of fallen leaves filled my nostrils as I made my way up the trail. After a few hours of hiking, I found the perfect spot to set up camp, a small clearing surrounded by towering maples and oaks, their leaves a vibrant tapestry of red and gold. As I pitched my tent and organized my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest seemed unusually quiet, no birds chirping, no squirrels scurrying about. I chalked it up to the changing seasons and my overactive imagination. After all, I'd been on countless solo trips before without incident. As night fell, I heated up some freeze-dried pasta on my portable stove and sat on a fallen log, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The silence that had unnerved me earlier now felt peaceful. I finished my meal, secured my food in a bare canister, and crawled into my sleeping bag, exhausted from the day's hike. I must have dozed off quickly because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by an overwhelming sense of dread. My eyes snapped open, but I couldn't move. Not a finger, not a toe. Panic surged through me as I realized I was experiencing sleep paralysis, something I'd read about but never experienced firsthand. The interior of my tent was pitch black, but I could sense a presence, something malevolent, watching me. I tried to scream, to move, to do anything, but my body remained frozen. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Suddenly I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A dark, shadowy figure seemed to be circling my tent. I could hear the leaves crunching under its feet, the sound growing louder as it drew closer. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what was happening. Was it a bear? A person? Or something else entirely? The figure stopped right outside my tent. I could see its silhouette through the thin fabric, looming over me. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to bend at unnatural angles. I wanted to squeeze my eyes shut to block out the terrifying sight, but I couldn't even do that. Then, to my horror, I saw a hand, if you could call it that, press against the side of the tent. It was more like a claw, with long, sharp fingers that left indentations in the fabric. I could hear a low, guttural breathing that didn't sound human or animal. It was something else entirely. The paralysis held me in its grip as I watched, helpless, as more shadowy figures joined the first. They moved around my tent, their movements jerky and unnatural. I could hear them whispering in a language I didn't understand, the sounds sending chills down my spine. What felt like hours passed, though I knew it couldn't have been more than minutes. The figures continued their eerie dance around my tent, occasionally pressing against the fabric, their touch leaving icy trails of fear across my skin. I prayed for it to end, for my body to respond, for anyone or anything to come and chase these entities away. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, when I felt like my mind was about to shatter from the sheer terror of the situation, I heard a new sound. It was faint at first, but growing louder. The hoot of an owl. The shadowy figures froze, their whispers cutting off abruptly. As the owl's call echoed through the forest, the presence I had felt began to recede. One by one, the shadows melted away into the darkness. The oppressive weight on my chest lifted, and I gasped as I finally regained control of my body. I sat up so quickly I nearly hit my head on the top of the tent, my breath coming in ragged pants. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn it on. When the beam finally illuminated the interior of my tent, I half expected to see claw marks or some evidence of the nightmare I had just experienced. But everything was exactly as I had left it. Despite the normalcy of my surroundings, I couldn't shake the bone-deep terror that had taken hold of me. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig outside sent my heart racing. I knew there was no way I could go back to sleep. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my sleeping bag, flashlight clutched in my trembling hands. I jumped at every sound, convinced that at any moment those shadowy figures would return. The hours crawled by at an agonizing pace. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The night was over, but the fear lingered. I didn't waste any time packing up my camp. My hands were still shaking as I rolled up my sleeping bag and collapsed my tent. I hit the trail just as the sun was peeking over the horizon, my pace much quicker than it had been the day before. As I hiked, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Sleep paralysis, my logical mind insisted. Vivid hallucinations brought on by stress in an unfamiliar environment. But a part of me, the primal part that had felt the malevolence of those shadowy figures, wasn't so sure. I made it back to my car in record time, tossing my gear in the trunk and peeling out of the parking lot. As the Catskills receded in my rearview mirror, I felt a mix of relief and lingering unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had encountered something that night, something that defied explanation. To this day, I'm not sure what really happened in those woods. Was it all in my mind, a terrifying but ultimately harmless episode of sleep paralysis? Or had I stumbled upon something darker, something that lurks in the shadows of those ancient mountains? One thing's for certain, I've never gone camping alone since that night, and I don't think I ever will again. Some experiences change you, and this one left me with a deep-seated fear of what might be hiding just beyond the veil of our normal perception. I'd always considered myself an experienced hiker. Growing up in Vermont, I'd spent countless weekends exploring the Green Mountains with my family, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered on the Appalachian Trail last summer. It was mid-July, and I'd decided to take a solo trip to clear my head after a messy breakup. I'd been planning this hike for months, meticulously packing my gear and studying the trail maps. My goal was to cover a 50-mile stretch of the trail in Georgia over the course of 5 days. The first 2 days were uneventful. The weather was perfect, and I was making good time. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in months. On the third day, however, everything changed. I woke up early, eager to cover some ground before the heat of the day set in. The trail was more challenging than I'd anticipated, with steep inclines and rocky terrain. By midday, I was exhausted and decided to take a break. I sat down on a fallen log, pulled out my water bottle, and consulted my map. That's when I realized something was wrong. The landmarks around me didn't match what I was seeing on the map. I tried to retrace my steps mentally, but nothing made sense. A knot formed in my stomach as the reality set in. I was lost. I tried to stay calm, remembering all the survival tips I'd learned over the years. I knew the smart thing to do was to stay put and wait for help. But as the hours ticked by and the sun began to dip below the tree line, panic started to set in. Just as I was about to give up hope, I spotted something through the trees. A clearing. Relief washed over me as I made my way towards it, thinking I'd found a campsite or maybe even a ranger station. What I found instead made my blood run cold. It was indeed a campsite, but it was clear no one had been there for a while. A small tent stood partially collapsed, its fabric torn and dirty. Personal belongings were strewn about: a backpack, some cooking utensils, and oddly, a pair of hiking boots that looked almost new. My instincts told me to turn back, to keep looking for the main trail. But darkness was falling fast, and I knew I couldn't risk wandering in the woods at night. Reluctantly, I decided to make camp. As I set up my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this place. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to rationalize my unease, blaming it on my nerves from getting lost. While gathering some firewood, I noticed something poking out from under a pile of leaves. A small, leather-bound book. Curious, I picked it up and brushed off the debris. It was a journal. I knew I shouldn't read it. It was a massive invasion of privacy. But my curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it to a random page. What I read made my skin crawl. The journal belonged to a hiker named Mark. His early entries were typical: descriptions of the trail, wildlife sightings, the occasional complaint about sore feet. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone changed dramatically. Mark wrote about feeling watched, about hearing strange noises in the night that didn't sound like any animal he knew. He described finding his belongings moved or missing, even though he was alone. The entries became increasingly frantic and paranoid. The final entry, dated just 2 weeks ago, sent chills down my spine. Mark wrote, "It's out there. I can feel it. Watching, waiting. I don't think I'll make it out of here. If anyone finds this, please, don't stay here. Run. Before it's too late." I slammed the journal shut, my heart pounding. I told myself it was just the ramblings of someone who'd spent too much time alone in the woods. But as I looked around the abandoned campsite, I couldn't help but wonder, what had happened to Mark? As night fell, I retreated to my tent, zipping it up tight. I lay there in the darkness, straining my ears for any unusual sounds. For a while, all I could hear was the normal nighttime chorus of the forest, crickets chirping, the occasional hoot of an owl. Then, around midnight, I heard it. A twig snapping, much closer to my tent than I was comfortable with. I held my breath, listening intently. Another snap, then another. Something was moving around the campsite. I reached for my flashlight with trembling hands, debating whether or not to look outside. Before I could decide, I heard something that made my blood freeze. A low, guttural growl that didn't sound like any animal I'd ever encountered. The noise circled my tent, getting closer and closer. I could hear heavy breathing, punctuated by occasional sniffs as if it was trying to catch my scent. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, certain that at any moment, whatever was out there would tear through the thin fabric of my tent. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the other side of the campsite. It sounded like something had knocked over the pile of cooking utensils. The creature let out a startled yelp, and I heard it bound away into the underbrush. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, jumping at every sound. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I quickly packed up my gear, my hands shaking so badly I could barely tie my bootlaces. Just as I was about to leave, I noticed something that hadn't been there the night before. Large, strange-looking tracks in the soft earth around my tent. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen, too big to be a bear or a wolf, with long, sharp claw marks gouging the soil. I didn't stick around to investigate further. I picked a direction and started walking, pushing through my exhaustion and fear. After several hours of frantic hiking, I miraculously stumbled onto the main trail. I've never been so relieved to see other hikers in my life. I made it back to civilization that day, but the experience haunted me. I reported the abandoned campsite to the park rangers, but when they went to investigate, they found nothing. No tent, no belongings, no tracks. It was as if the whole thing had never existed. To this day, I can't explain what happened out there in the woods. Sometimes I almost convince myself it was all a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and dehydration. But then I remember the journal, the noises, those tracks, and I know that something was out there. Something that didn't want to be found. I still hike, but never alone, and never on that stretch of the Appalachian Trail. Some mysteries, I've learned, are better left unsolved. The excitement of our family camping trip to Sequoia National Park quickly turned into a nightmare I'll never forget. My wife, our 2 kids, and I had been planning this vacation for months, eager to escape the hustle of city life and reconnect with nature. We arrived at the park on a warm summer afternoon, the giant sequoias towering above us as we set up our campsite. The first day was perfect. We hiked through lush forests, marveled at the ancient trees, and enjoyed a peaceful evening around the campfire. Our kids, aged 10 and 8, were thrilled to be sleeping in a tent, away from their screens and surrounded by wilderness. Little did we know that our idyllic getaway was about to take a terrifying turn. On the second day, we decided to venture deeper into the park for a day-long hike. As we packed our backpacks with water, snacks, and basic supplies, I noticed a faint smell of smoke in the air. I brushed it off, assuming it was just someone's campfire. We set off on the trail, leaving our car at the trailhead parking lot. About 2 hours into our hike, the smell of smoke grew stronger. I started to feel uneasy, but I didn't want to alarm my family. We pressed on, admiring the breathtaking views and pointing out interesting plants and wildlife to the kids. It wasn't until we reached a clearing that we saw it, a plume of dark smoke rising in the distance. My wife and I exchanged worried glances. We knew wildfires were a risk in California, but we never thought we'd find ourselves face to face with one. I pulled out my phone to check for alerts, but there was no signal. The smoke was getting thicker, and I could see fear creeping into my children's eyes. We made the decision to turn back immediately. As we hurried down the trail, the wind picked up, carrying ash and embers. The sky turned an eerie orange, and the sound of distant crackling grew louder. Our pace quickened, but it felt like we were moving in slow motion. Halfway back to the trailhead, we encountered a park ranger rushing up the path. His face was grim as he told us a wildfire had broken out and was spreading rapidly. He urged us to head to the nearest evacuation point, which was in the opposite direction of our car. My heart sank as I realized we'd have to leave behind our vehicle and all our camping gear. We followed the ranger's instructions, veering off onto a different trail. The smoke was getting thicker by the minute, making it hard to see and breathe. My youngest started coughing and I gave her my bandana to cover her mouth and nose. We had to keep moving. The next few hours were a blur of fear and adrenaline. We stumbled through smoke-filled trails, the heat of the approaching fire at our backs. The usually serene forest had become a hellscape of falling embers and ashing leaves. Every few minutes we'd hear the thunderous crack of a tree succumbing to the flames, sending shivers down our spines. As we pushed on, the challenges mounted. Visibility dropped to mere feet in front of us. My eyes stung and each breath felt like inhaling sandpaper. Our water supply dwindled quickly as we tried to stay hydrated in the oppressive heat. The kids were exhausted, scared, and struggling to keep up. My wife and I took turns carrying them on our backs, ignoring our own fatigue and focusing solely on survival. The sound of the fire grew louder, and I could swear I felt its heat on the back of my neck. Panic threatened to overwhelm me as I realized we might not make it to safety in time. The trail seemed endless, each turn revealing only more smoke and uncertainty. Just when I thought we couldn't go on any further, we heard the distant sound of a helicopter. Hope surged through me, but it was quickly tempered by the realization that the thick canopy above us made it impossible for anyone to spot us from the air. We were on our own. As we rounded a bend in the trail, we came face to face with a wall of flames. The fire had jumped ahead, cutting off our escape route. My wife let out a sob, and the kids started crying. I felt utterly helpless, trapped between the advancing inferno and the fire at our backs. In that moment of desperation, I noticed a small ravine off to our left. It was steep and rocky, but it seemed to be relatively clear of vegetation. Without a second thought, I ushered my family towards it. We scrambled down the slope, loose rocks tumbling around us. The descent was treacherous, but it was our only option. At the bottom of the ravine, we found a small stream. The air was clearer here, shielded somewhat by the high rock walls on either side. We splashed water on our faces and drank greedily, the cool liquid a stark contrast to the inferno above. We huddled together in that ravine for what felt like an eternity. The roar of the fire raged above us, but we were sheltered from the worst of it. Hours passed, marked only by the gradual shift of shadows across the rocky ground. As night fell, the glow of the fire painted the sky a menacing red. We took turns staying awake, alert for any sign of rescue or further danger. The kids, exhausted beyond measure, finally fell into a fitful sleep. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that we heard voices calling out. At first, I thought I was hallucinating from exhaustion and smoke inhalation, but then I saw the beams of flashlights sweeping across the ravine walls. I shouted until my voice was hoarse, waving my arms frantically. The relief I felt when I saw the firefighters making their way down to us was indescribable. They were part of a search and rescue team, scouring the area for stranded hikers like us. The firefighters checked us over for injuries and gave us oxygen masks. They explained that the fire had been contained on this side of the park, but large areas were still burning. As they helped us climb out of the ravine, I saw the blackened landscape around us, barely recognizable as the lush forest we had walked through just a day before. We were evacuated by helicopter to a nearby town, where we received medical attention and were reunited with other evacuees. The relief of safety was overwhelming, but it was tempered by the knowledge of how close we had come to tragedy. In the days that followed, we learned the full extent of the wildfire. Thousands of acres had burned and many people had lost their homes. Our car and all our belongings were gone, consumed by the flames, but we had escaped with our lives, and for that, I was immensely grateful. The experience left an indelible mark on our family. What was meant to be a peaceful retreat into nature had turned into a fight for survival against one of its most destructive forces. As we flew home, I looked down at the scarred landscape below, a stark reminder of nature's power and our own vulnerability. I've been hiking for over 2 decades, tackling some of the most challenging trails across the country. but nothing could have prepared me for what happened in Olympic National Park last summer. It was supposed to be a simple day hike, 6 hours max, through the lush Hoh rainforest. I'd done it before and I was confident in my abilities. The morning started perfectly. The air was crisp, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. I set out early, my backpack loaded with water, energy bars, and my trusty navigation tools. The first couple of hours were exactly what I expected. Breathtaking views of ancient trees draped in moss, the occasional glimpse of wildlife, and the satisfying crunch of the trail beneath my boots. Around midday, I decided to explore a less traveled path that branched off the main trail. It looked interesting, and I figured I could easily find my way back. That decision changed everything. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the canopy grew thicker, blocking out more and more sunlight. The air became heavy with moisture, and the sounds of the forest seemed to change, becoming more muffled and distant. I should have turned back then, but curiosity pushed me forward. It wasn't until late afternoon that I realized I was in trouble. The landmarks I'd been using to navigate had become unfamiliar, and the path I'd been following had all but disappeared. I reached for my map and compass only to find that they weren't in my pack. My stomach dropped as I remembered setting them down during my lunch break. In my excitement to explore, I must have left them behind. No problem, I thought. I'll just use my phone's GPS. But when I pulled it out, the screen was black. Dead. I'd been taking so many photos that the battery had drained without me noticing. Panic started to set in as I realized I was lost in one of the most dense and unforgiving forests in the country, with no way to contact anyone or find my bearings. As the light began to fade, I knew I had to find shelter for the night. I managed to construct a rudimentary lean-to using fallen branches and leaves, but sleep was almost impossible. Every sound, the hoot of an owl, the rustle in the underbrush, sent my heart racing. Was it a harmless animal or something more dangerous? The next morning, I woke up stiff, cold, and disoriented. My water supply was already running low and hunger was gnawing at my stomach. I decided to follow a small stream, hoping it would lead to a larger body of water and potentially to civilization. The terrain was treacherous, slippery rocks, fallen logs, and thick undergrowth that seemed to grab at my ankles with every step. By midday, exhaustion was setting in. I hadn't seen any signs of human presence and the forest seemed to be getting denser. The stream I'd been following widened into a series of small waterfalls, creating a natural obstacle course. As I tried to navigate around one particularly steep drop, my foot slipped on a moss-covered rock. I felt a sharp pain shoot through my ankle as I tumbled down the embankment, landing hard on the rocky shore below. Dazed and in pain, I dragged myself to the water's edge. My ankle was swollen and throbbing, but at least it wasn't broken. I tore a strip from my shirt to wrap it, knowing that this injury would make my situation even more precarious. As night fell again, the reality of my situation hit me hard. 2 days lost, injured, and with dwindling supplies. Would anyone even know I was missing yet? I hadn't told anyone my exact plans for the hike, a rookie mistake that I was now paying for dearly. The third day brought new challenges. My water was gone, forcing me to drink directly from the stream despite the risks. Hunger was a constant companion, and I resorted to eating berries that I recognized, praying they weren't poisonous. The forest seemed to be playing tricks on me. More than once I thought I heard voices or saw movement in the corner of my eye, only to find nothing when I turned to look. It was on this day that I had my most terrifying encounter. As I limped along the stream, I heard a low growl behind me. Turning slowly, I found myself face to face with a black bear no more than 30 feet away. My heart pounded as I remembered the safety protocols. Make yourself big, make noise, don't run. For what felt like an eternity, the bear and I stood our ground, neither moving. Then, miraculously, it turned and lumbered away into the forest. I collapsed to the ground, shaking uncontrollably, the adrenaline leaving me completely drained. By the fourth day, I was in bad shape. Dehydration and hunger had taken their toll, and my injured ankle made every step agony. The dense forest had given way to more rocky terrain, and I found myself navigating steep inclines and precarious ledges. It was on one of these ledges that I had my closest call. Exhausted and dizzy, I misjudged a step and felt the ground give way beneath me. For a heart-stopping moment, I was in free fall, certain that this was the end. By some miracle, I managed to grab onto a protruding root, halting my descent. Hanging there, muscles screaming, I knew I had to pull myself up or die trying. With every ounce of strength I had left, I clawed my way back onto solid ground, collapsing in a heap of tears and ragged breaths. As the sun began to set on what I was sure would be my last day alive, something caught my eye. A flash of orange in the distance, unnatural against the greens and browns of the forest. Summoning what little energy I had left, I moved towards it, hope rekindling for the first time in days. As I got closer, I realized what it was, a search and rescue marker. They were looking for me. With renewed determination, I pushed on, following the markers until I heard the most beautiful sound I've ever heard, the whir of helicopter blades. The rescue team found me just as night was falling. They later told me I was over 20 miles from where I should have been, in an area rarely traversed by hikers. As they lifted me into the helicopter, the reality of my ordeal hit me. 5 days lost in one of the most unforgiving environments in the country, surviving on nothing but determination and dumb luck. The doctors at the hospital said I was lucky to be alive. Severe dehydration, malnutrition, a sprained ankle, and countless cuts and bruises. But I was alive. As I lay in the hospital bed, the full weight of what I'd been through settled over me. The forest, which I'd always seen as a place of beauty and adventure, had shown me its darker, more dangerous side. It was a humbling experience, one that I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. I had always dreamed of solo camping in the Grand Canyon. The vast, rugged landscape called to me, promising solitude and adventure. Little did I know that this trip would haunt me for reasons I could never have imagined. It was late September, and the scorching summer heat had finally given way to more bearable temperatures. I had meticulously planned my route, aiming for a remote area of the North Rim, far from the usual tourist spots. After a grueling day of hiking, I found the perfect spot to set up camp, a small clearing with a breathtaking view of the canyon's depths. As I pitched my tent and prepared a simple dinner, I reveled in the silence. The sun was setting, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and purples. That's when I first noticed him, a solitary figure standing near the edge of a nearby cliff, about 100 yards from my campsite. At first, I didn't think much of it. Plenty of hikers come to admire the view, especially at sunset. But as the light faded and the stars began to appear, he remained motionless. A nagging feeling of unease crept over me. Something wasn't right. I debated whether to approach him. On one hand, it seemed unwise to engage with a stranger in such an isolated location. On the other, my instincts were screaming that this person might need help. After what felt like an eternity of internal struggle, I decided I couldn't just ignore the situation. Grabbing my flashlight, I cautiously made my way towards him. "Hey there," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Beautiful view, isn't it? Are you okay?" He turned slowly, and in the beam of my flashlight, I saw a man in his mid-40s, with disheveled hair and a gaunt face. His eyes were red-rimmed and vacant. "It doesn't matter anymore," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart began to race. I'd never been in a situation like this before, and I was acutely aware of how isolated we were. "Listen," I said, taking a cautious step closer. "Whatever's going on, I'm sure we can figure it out. Why don't you come back from the edge and we can talk?" He shook his head slowly. "You don't understand. There's nothing left for me. I've lost everything. My job, my family, my purpose. This is the only way out." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. This was real. This was happening. I racked my brain for something to say, anything that might change his mind. "I know things seem hopeless now, but please, give it one more day. Come back to my campsite. We can have some coffee, talk things through. There's always another way. For a moment I thought I saw a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, but then his expression hardened. "No," he said firmly. "This ends now. I'm sorry you had to see this." Before I could react, he turned and took a step towards the edge. I lunged forward, desperately trying to grab him, but I was too late. In a moment that will be forever seared into my memory, he stepped off the cliff and disappeared into the darkness below. I screamed. I screamed until my throat was raw, but the canyon only echoed my cries back at me. Frantically, I shone my flashlight over the edge, hoping against hope that he had somehow survived the fall. But the beam only illuminated sheer rock faces and empty air. Reality hit me like a punch to the gut. I had just witnessed a man take his own life, and there was absolutely nothing I could do about it. My hands shook uncontrollably as I fumbled for my phone, only to remember that I had no signal out here. The nearest ranger station was a day's hike away. I stumbled back to my campsite in a daze. The peaceful solitude I had sought now felt oppressive and terrifying. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every sound made me jump. I couldn't shake the image of the man's face just before he jumped, the mixture of resignation and despair that had been etched into his features. Sleep was out of the question. I spent the night huddled in my tent, alternating between fits of sobbing and periods of numb shock. The hours crawled by, each minute stretching into an eternity. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, wondering if there was something more I could have said or done. The guilt was overwhelming. As the first light of dawn broke over the canyon, I packed up my camp with shaking hands. I had to get to the ranger station as quickly as possible. The hike back was a blur of exhaustion and anxiety. Every step felt like it took monumental effort, and I was constantly fighting the urge to break down. When I finally reached the ranger station, the words tumbled out of me in a jumbled mess. The rangers, to their credit, took me seriously immediately. They radioed for a search and rescue team, while I gave them as many details as I could remember. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. I found myself in a helicopter guiding the team back to the spot where it had happened. As we approached, I felt my stomach lurch. Part of me hoped we wouldn't find anything, that somehow it had all been a terrible nightmare. But reality doesn't work that way. The search team found his body at the base of the cliff. I watched from a distance as they went about their grim work, feeling disconnected from my own body, as if I was watching a movie rather than living through this. After providing a formal statement, I was free to go. The rangers offered to arrange counseling, but I declined. I just wanted to get as far away from the Grand Canyon as possible. As I drove away, the magnificent landscape that had once filled me with awe now seemed tainted and hostile. I've tried to make sense of what happened that night, to find some meaning in the tragedy I witnessed. But the truth is, there are no easy answers. Sometimes life throws you into situations you're not prepared for, and all you can do is react in the moment. I don't know if I could have done anything differently, but the memory of that night in the Grand Canyon will stay with me forever. The Everglades had always been on our bucket list. My wife Sarah and I are avid campers, but we'd never ventured into Florida's famous wetlands before. We'd heard stories about its unique ecosystem, the diverse wildlife, and the sense of isolation you can experience there. Little did we know that our adventure would take a dark turn we never could have anticipated. We arrived at the park on a sunny Tuesday morning in October. The air was thick with humidity, but the temperature was perfect for outdoor activities. After checking in with the park rangers and getting our permits, we set up our campsite in a designated area. The first couple of days were exactly what we'd hoped for: peaceful hikes, bird watching, and even a guided boat tour through the mangroves. On our third day, we decided to be a bit more adventurous. We'd heard about a secluded area deeper in the park that was less frequented by tourists. The ranger we spoke to warned us to stick to the marked trails and bring plenty of water and insect repellent. We assured him we were experienced and would be careful. We set out early, just as the sun was rising. The morning mist hung low over the sawgrass, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere. As we hiked, the sounds of civilization faded away, replaced by the calls of birds and the occasional splash of something in the water. I remember feeling a sense of awe at the raw, untamed nature surrounding us. About 4 hours into our hike, we veered slightly off the main trail. There was a small clearing that looked perfect for a rest stop and to eat our packed lunch. As we sat on a fallen log munching on our sandwiches, Sarah noticed something odd about the ground near a cluster of trees at the edge of the clearing. "Hey, does that look weird to you?" she asked, pointing to a spot about 20 feet away. At first I didn't see anything unusual, but as I looked closer I realized there was something protruding from the earth. It was pale and seemed out of place among the rich, dark soil and green vegetation. Curiosity got the better of us. We approached cautiously, our hearts beginning to race as the shape became clearer. It wasn't until we were standing right over it that the horrifying reality set in. What we were looking at was unmistakably human, a partially exposed skull, its empty eye socket staring up at us from the ground. I felt my stomach lurch. Sarah let out a gasp and stumbled backward. For a moment, we just stood there, frozen in shock. The peaceful sounds of the Everglades seemed to fade away, replaced by a deafening silence. Once the initial shock wore off, we knew we had to act. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone to document the location. There was no signal, of course, but I made sure to save the GPS coordinates. Sarah, always the more level-headed of us in crisis situations, suggested we use some nearby branches to mark the spot, making it easier for the authorities to find later. As we worked, 1,000 questions raced through my mind. How long had these remains been here? Who was this person? What happened to them? The skull seemed old, bleached by the sun and elements. I couldn't help but wonder if this was someone who had gone missing years ago, their fate unknown until this moment. We knew we couldn't disturb the site any further. Once we had marked the location as best we could, we gathered our things and began the hike back. The journey that had taken us 4 hours in the morning now felt infinitely longer. Every snapping twig or rustle in the underbrush made us jump. The Everglades, which had seemed so beautiful and serene just hours before, now felt ominous and foreboding. We pushed ourselves to move faster, the need to report our discovery driving us forward. By the time we reached the ranger station, the sun was already setting. We must have looked a sight, sweaty, disheveled, and visibly shaken. The ranger on duty, a middle-aged man named Tom, immediately sensed something was wrong. "You folks all right?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. I took a deep breath and explained what we had found. Tom's expression grew serious as he listened. He immediately radioed for backup and asked us to wait while he contacted the proper authorities. The next few hours were a blur of questions and statements. We spoke with park officials, then local police. We provided the GPS coordinates and described the location as best we could. They assured us that a team would be sent out first thing in the morning to investigate. As the adrenaline wore off, exhaustion set in. The officials thanked us for reporting the discovery and told us we were free to go. We decided to pack up and leave the campground that night, neither of us feeling comfortable staying after what we'd experienced. On the drive home, Sarah and I barely spoke. The events of the day kept replaying in my mind. I couldn't shake the image of that skull, partially buried in the Everglades soil. It was a stark reminder of how unforgiving nature can be, and how easily secrets can be hidden in its vast expanses. We never found out the full story behind those remains. A few weeks later, we received a call from the detective assigned to the case. They confirmed that the skeleton was human and had likely been there for several years. They were working on identification, but warned us that in cases like these, answers often remain elusive. That camping trip to the Everglades was our last for a long time. It took months before we felt ready to venture into the wilderness again. Even now, years later, I can't look at a densely wooded area without wondering what secrets it might hold. Our experience taught us that even in places of great beauty, darkness can lurk just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway. My friends and I had been planning this camping trip to the Smoky Mountains for months, eager to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. We were a group of 5, myself, my best friend Jake, his girlfriend Sarah, and our college buddies Mike and Lisa. As we drove up the winding mountain roads, the excitement was palpable. The lush green forests and misty peaks promised a perfect retreat from our daily grind. We arrived at the campground late Friday afternoon. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers. We found a secluded spot, nestled between towering trees and a babbling creek. It seemed ideal, far enough from other campers to feel like we had the wilderness to ourselves, but close enough to civilization that we didn't feel completely isolated. As we set up our tents and unpacked our gear, I couldn't shake off a nagging feeling of unease. I chalked it up to being out of my comfort zone, away from the familiar sounds and sights of the city. We spent the evening grilling hot dogs, sharing stories, and laughing around the campfire. As night fell, the forest came alive with the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. It must have been around midnight when we decided to turn in. The fire had died down to embers, and a chill had settled in the air. I zipped up my sleeping bag, listening to the soft murmur of the creek nearby. Sleep came easily after our long day of hiking and setting up camp. I'm not sure how long I had been asleep when I was jolted awake by a sound. At first I thought it was part of a dream, angry voices carried on the wind. But as I became more alert, I realized the voices were real, and they were coming from somewhere nearby. I lay still, straining my ears. The voices grew louder, more heated. I could make out two distinct male voices, their words unclear but their tone unmistakably aggressive. My heart began to race. I fumbled for my phone to check the time, 2:37 a.m. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, followed by a pained yell. The sound of a scuffle ensued, punctuated by grunts and the unmistakable sound of fists connecting with flesh. I heard Jake stir in the tent next to mine. "Hey," he whispered, "you hearing this?" I nodded, then realized he couldn't see me in the darkness. "Yeah," I whispered back. "It sounds bad." We unzipped our tents as quietly as possible and crawled out. Mike emerged from his tent too, looking groggy and confused. The girls were still asleep, or at least pretending to be. In the pale moonlight, we could see movement through the trees, maybe 50 yards from our campsite. Two figures were grappling with each other, their shadows dancing grotesquely in the dim light. We watched, frozen in horror, as one of the men picked up what looked like a large branch and swung it at the other's head. There was a sickening thud, and the second man crumpled to the ground. He didn't get up. "Holy shit," Mike breathed. "Did he just—" We didn't stick around to find out. As silently as we could, we woke Sarah and Lisa and explained the situation in hushed, panicked whispers. There was no debate about what to do next. We had to get out of there, fast. With shaking hands, we hurriedly packed up our essential belongings, leaving behind anything we couldn't quickly grab. Every snapping twig, every rustle of fabric seemed deafeningly loud in the quiet night. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a shadowy figure emerging from the trees. We left our tent standing, hoping it would buy us some time if the attacker came looking. The weight of our backpacks felt reassuring as we set off down the trail, using the dim light of our phones to guide our way. We moved as quickly and quietly as possible, our breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful earlier, now felt oppressive and threatening. Every shadow could be hiding danger, every sound a potential pursuer. We stumbled over roots and rocks, our progress painfully slow in the darkness. After what felt like hours but was probably only about 45 minutes, we reached a more open area of the trail. In the distance we could see lights, the ranger station. We picked up our pace, almost running now, the promise of safety spurring us on. As we burst into the lit area around the station, a startled ranger emerged from the building. He took in our disheveled appearance and panicked expressions with a mix of concern and suspicion. Between gasps for air, we managed to explain what we had witnessed. The ranger immediately radioed for backup and took down our statements. He assured us that they would investigate immediately and asked us to stay put while they sent out a search party. The next few hours passed in a blur. More rangers arrived along with local police. We were questioned multiple times, asked to pinpoint on a map where we had been camping and where we had witnessed the fight. As dawn broke, news came back that they had found our abandoned campsite, but there was no sign of the two men we had seen fighting. They did, however, find signs of a struggle and what appeared to be bloodstains on some leaves and a fallen branch. The police took samples for analysis and expanded their search area. We were eventually cleared to leave, with promises to stay in touch in case they needed any further information. As we drove down the mountain in the early morning light, exhausted and shell-shocked, I couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and lingering fear. The trip that was supposed to be a peaceful escape had turned into a nightmare. We never found out what happened to those two men in the forest that night. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear those angry voices and the sickening thud of that branch connecting. It serves as a stark reminder that danger can lurk even in the most beautiful places, and that the line between a perfect getaway and a horrifying ordeal can be terrifyingly thin. I've always been drawn to the solitude of the desert. There's something about the vast, arid landscape that speaks to my soul. That's why I decided to take a solo camping trip to Joshua Tree National Park last summer. I had no idea that this peaceful retreat would turn into the most terrifying night of my life. I arrived at the park on a scorching hot day in July. The sun beat down mercilessly as I set up my small tent in a secluded area far from the main campgrounds. I wanted to immerse myself in nature, to disconnect from the world and find some inner peace. The park was eerily quiet, with only the occasional rustle of a lizard scurrying across the sand or a hawk's cry echoing in the distance. As the day wore on, I explored the surreal landscape, marveling at the twisted Joshua trees and massive rock formations. The heat was intense, but I was prepared with plenty of water and sunscreen. I even managed to do some bouldering, testing my skills on the smaller rock faces. By late afternoon, I was exhausted but content, looking forward to a quiet evening watching the sunset. That's when I noticed the first sign that something was off. A cool breeze picked up, bringing with it the faint scent of moisture. I glanced at the horizon and saw dark clouds gathering in the distance. It was an unusual sight in this typically cloudless sky, but I didn't think much of it. After all, rain in the desert was rare, especially in summer. As night fell, the wind grew stronger, and the temperature dropped rapidly. I zipped up my jacket and huddled in my tent, listening to the eerie whistle of the wind through the Joshua trees. The clouds had moved in faster than I expected, blotting out the stars and plunging the desert into an unsettling darkness. Around midnight, the first drops of rain hit my tent. It started as a gentle patter, almost soothing, but within minutes it transformed into a torrential downpour unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The rain hammered against the thin fabric of my tent with such force that I feared it might tear. Lightning flashed, illuminating the desert in brief, terrifying bursts. The thunder that followed was deafening, seeming to shake the very ground beneath me. I realized with growing horror that I was in the middle of a severe thunderstorm, completely exposed in one of the most isolated parts of the park. As the storm intensified, I noticed water beginning to pool around my tent. The parched desert soil, unaccustomed to such a deluge, couldn't absorb the water fast enough. What had been bone-dry earth just hours ago was quickly turning into a muddy quagmire. I unzipped the tent flap to assess the situation and was immediately drenched by the horizontal rain. Lightning struck a nearby Joshua tree, the crack of thunder instantaneous and deafening. The acrid smell of ozone filled the air as the tree burst into flames, only to be quickly extinguished by the relentless rain. Panic set in as I realized the gravity of my situation. I was alone, in the dark, with no cell service, in the middle of a flash flood. The water was rising alarmingly fast, already ankle-deep around my tent. I had to move, and fast. Grabbing my backpack and sleeping bag, I abandoned the tent and started scrambling up the nearest rock formation. The rain made the stones treacherously slippery, and more than once I nearly lost my footing. Each time lightning struck, it illuminated the transforming landscape below. What had been a dry desert floor was now a churning river of muddy water. I managed to find a small overhang in the rocks, barely big enough to shelter me from the worst of the rain. Huddled there, soaking wet and shivering, I watched in awe and terror as nature unleashed its fury. The wind howled, driving the rain sideways and carrying with it loose vegetation and debris. I saw my tent, along with other camping gear I hadn't managed to grab, swept away by the floodwaters. Throughout the night I remained vigilant, ready to climb higher if the water continued to rise. The lightning strikes were getting closer, each flash followed almost immediately by ear-splitting thunder. One bolt hit so close that I felt the heat on my face and saw spots in my vision for several minutes afterward. As the hours crawled by, I found myself in a surreal state of exhausted alertness. The constant barrage of sensory input, the howling wind, the crashes of thunder, the cold rain, kept me from relaxing even for a moment. I was acutely aware that one wrong move, one slip on the wet rocks, could be fatal. Just before dawn, the storm began to subside. The rain lessened to a drizzle, and the time between lightning strikes grew longer. As the first light of day began to illuminate the landscape, I was shocked by the transformation. The once parched desert floor was now crisscrossed with newly formed streams and pools of standing water. Uprooted Joshua trees and cacti lay scattered about, victims of the flood and wind. Cautiously, I made my way down from my rocky shelter. The ground was still sodden, my feet sinking into the mud with each step. I trudged to where my campsite had been, but there was nothing left. My tent, most of my supplies, even my car keys, all gone, swept away by the flash flood. I realized I had no choice but to make my way back to the park entrance on foot. It was a long, exhausting trek through the mud and debris. The desert sun, now shining brightly as if the night's chaos had never happened, quickly dried the standing water, leaving behind a crust of cracked mud. When I finally reached the ranger station, I must have looked like a wild man, covered in mud, sunburned, and probably wild-eyed from the night's ordeal. The rangers were shocked to see me. Apparently they had issued storm warnings and evacuated the main campgrounds, but hadn't been able to reach the more remote areas where I had been camping. As I sat in the ranger station, sipping a cup of much-needed coffee and waiting for a locksmith to come and make a new key for my car, I couldn't help but reflect on the experience. The desert, which I had always seen as a place of peaceful solitude, had revealed its other face, a place of raw, untamed power. I lost most of my gear that night, but I gained a profound respect for the unpredictability of nature. The next time I go camping, I'll be sure to check the weather forecast more carefully. And maybe, just maybe, I'll stick a little closer to civilization. I've always considered myself an experienced hiker, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened during my solo backpacking trip to Glacier National Park last summer. The park's rugged beauty had always called to me, and I'd spent months planning this adventure, mapping out trails and packing the right gear. Little did I know that my well-laid plans would soon unravel in the most terrifying way possible. It was my third day on the trail when things took a turn. I'd been making good progress, reveling in the solitude and breathtaking vistas. The weather was perfect, clear skies, a gentle breeze, and the kind of crisp mountain air that makes you feel alive. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have this slice of wilderness almost entirely to myself. As I rounded a bend on a particularly remote stretch of trail, I spotted a figure in the distance. At first, I was excited at the prospect of some human interaction after days alone, but as I got closer, that excitement quickly turned to unease. The man looked disheveled, his clothes torn and dirty, his hair wild and unkempt. He was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself, and when he saw me, his eyes lit up with a desperate intensity that made my skin crawl. "Hey! Hey, you!" he called out, his voice cracking. "Thank God. I've been lost for days. Can you help me?" I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn and run. But the hiker's code is sacred. You don't leave someone in distress in the wilderness. So, against my better judgment, I approached him cautiously. "Are you okay?" I asked, keeping a safe distance. "Do you need water or food?" He shook his head frantically. No, I just need to get out of here. I've been wandering in circles. Can you show me the way back to the trailhead?" Something about his story didn't add up. He didn't look dehydrated or starved, just off. but I nodded, figuring I could at least point him in the right direction and be on my way. As we started walking, he introduced himself as Mike and began telling me about how he'd gotten separated from his hiking group. But his story kept changing. First, it was a group of friends, then a solo trip gone wrong, then a work retreat. With each version, my suspicion grew. We'd been walking for about an hour when Mike suddenly stopped and looked around nervously. "We need to move faster," he said, his voice low and urgent. "They might be catching up." "Who?" I asked, my heart rate spiking. He looked at me, his eyes wild. "The people I'm running from, I did something bad, really bad. I can't go back." In that moment, I realized I was alone in the wilderness with a potential fugitive. My mind raced, trying to figure out how to get out of this situation safely. I decided my best bet was to play along, to not let him know I was onto him. "Okay, Mike," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let's keep moving then. The trailhead can't be too far." But I knew we were nowhere near the trailhead. I was deliberately leading us on a route I hoped would bring us closer to more populated areas of the park. As we walked, Mike's behavior became increasingly erratic. He'd jump at every snapping twig, every rustling leaf. He kept looking over his shoulder, muttering about them being close. I tried to engage him in conversation, hoping to glean more information about who he really was and what he'd done. "So, Mike," I ventured, "where are you from originally?" He hesitated, then launched into a story about growing up in Seattle. But just an hour later, he was talking about his childhood in rural Montana. The inconsistencies were glaring, but I nodded along, pretending to believe every word. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky, and I knew we'd have to make camp soon. The thought of spending a night in the wilderness with this unpredictable stranger terrified me. I was running out of options in daylight. Just as I was about to suggest we stop for the night, we heard voices in the distance. Mike froze, his eyes wide with panic. "They've found me," he whispered, his voice trembling. Before I could react, he grabbed my arm, his grip painfully tight. "You have to hide me," he hissed. "If they find me, they'll kill me. And probably you too for helping me." And my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I knew I had to make a decision fast. In a split second, I made up my mind. "Okay," I said, trying to sound calm. "I know a good hiding spot just up ahead. Follow me." I led him off the trail into a dense thicket of trees. As soon as we were out of sight of the path, I pointed to a large boulder. "Behind there," I whispered. "You'll be well hidden." As Mike scrambled behind the rock, I took a deep breath and made my move. I turned and ran as fast as I could back to the trail, my legs pumping with adrenaline-fueled strength I didn't know I possessed. I burst onto the path just as a group of hikers came into view. They looked startled to see me emerge so suddenly from the woods, covered in scratches and breathing heavily. "Are you okay?" one of them asked, concern evident in her voice. I nodded, trying to catch my breath. "I'm fine," I managed to gasp out. "But there's a man back there. I think he might be dangerous. We need to alert the park rangers." The group quickly sprang into action. One of them had a satellite phone and called for help while the others stayed with me, offering water and making sure I was all right. It felt like hours, but it was probably only about 45 minutes before we heard the sound of a helicopter. Park rangers arrived shortly after, and I gave them a full account of what had happened. They found Mike still hiding behind the boulder, clearly surprised and angry that I had betrayed him. As they led him away in handcuffs, I overheard one of the rangers say something about him matching the description of a man wanted for a series of break-ins in nearby towns. I never found out the full story of who Mike really was or what he'd done. The rangers took my statement and then escorted me back to the trailhead. They offered to airlift me out, but I declined. After what I'd been through, I needed the long walk back to process everything. As I made my way out of the park over the next 2 days, I couldn't shake the feeling of how close I'd come to real danger. The wilderness I'd always seen as a refuge suddenly felt different, tainted somehow by the experience. I completed my hike as planned, but those final days were a blur of hypervigilance and restless nights. When I finally reached my car at the trailhead, I felt a rush of relief so intense it left me lightheaded. I drove home in silence, the events of those terrifying hours in the backcountry playing on repeat in my mind. The majestic peaks of Glacier National Park faded in my rearview mirror, along with my naive belief that the only dangers in the wilderness were the ones found in nature. Hey there again. Hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to hit the like button and to subscribe to the channel. This will really help the channel to grow and you can be notified of the new videos. And I have something more for you. I chose another video for you to watch. Just click the card here to go to the video. Hope you like it. See you there.